you were telling me just before we started this webinar that it's essentially about how to teach well, isn't it? Do you want to give us a bit more information on what's going to be happening today?
Yeah, differentiation isn't really a special technique that you add on. It's about thinking from the ground up in a way that makes sure that every student learns. We're only going to be able to look at aspects of differentiation today. There's really sort of three major sort of things we need to look at, and we're going to look at the most important one of those three. And if there's interest, I'm very happy to look at the other ones later.
Okay, fantastic. And before we start, just again, hello to everyone who's joined us today. You may have already come to a set webinar. If you haven't, just to explain a few things about how it works. So we obviously can't hear you, but there's an inbox to the right of the screen where you can type in your thoughts, any questions, anything at all. I'm going to be turning my mic off soon and my camera, and just kind of looking at what's going on behind the scenes and filtering the questions through to ask either throughout the webinar or at the end. So I can see a few have already come in now. So hello to Gary and Anne and Sarah as well. There's going to be a couple of polls as well, which is just really a bit of fun that you can take part in. We'll be doing that. And if you look to the left of your screen, you'll see some icons. It's the second one down, I think, which is resources. If this sharing slide thing isn't looking completely clear to you, you can actually download the presentation as well, and you can keep this for after the webinar. And also there's a CPD certificate for you to show you that you've come along today and completed an hour of CPD. That will pull through your name, so it's all personalized. And to save that, you just have to right click and go as if you're going to print it, and then save as PDF. I will go through that again at the end. If anyone has any problems, you can email me and I will help you with that. And I'll give you all that information as we finish. So without further ado, I will be quiet now and let Jeff begin.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. There we go.
So I think that should come up in a minute.
How's that? Is that showing now, Julia?
Yep, that's perfect.
Right. I think it's probably better if I then stop, get myself out of the way. Oh, I am out of the way. Right. Okay. So, Julia, can I just ask? Can everybody just see the whole of the slide?
Yep, I can see everything. If anybody can't, let me know. Okay. So I don't get 300 people saying yes, I can see it. Okay.
Okay. Well, hello everybody, and thank you so much for coming. Differentiation is a posh way for saying coping with differences, differences between students, and in terms of their ability or their preferences or their attainment or their prior learning and so on, and indeed any other differences. But it's about quality learning, really, rather than an add-on strategy. You don't sort of do your lesson planning and then say, okay, I'm going to do X to make sure I'm differentiating. It's not a tweak. It's not an add-on. It's really planning correctly from the bottom up, as it were. If you've been to some of the other webinars, I'll describe this high-quality learning process. When we learn, just to go over it again very quickly, when we learn, we make interconnections in our brain to encode the meaning of what we've learned. And that's shown red in the diagram, little red sort of network inside the brain there. And it has to be connected to what we already know. That's the black network that's shown in the brain. Obviously, this is very diagrammatic. So when we learn, then, if we can't see the construct, as it's called, that the student has made. You can't see the student's version of what you've taught them, but they have created that. So because we can't see what the construct that the student has made, we have to ask the student to do some work, to answer a question, to express their view or understanding of what you've taught to them. And this enables us to check and correct that version of what you've taught, because of course that's what learning is. It's creating a version of what you've taught in the student's own head. The version is made by the student. And the student's work, and I mean that in the widest possible sense, it could be just a simple verbal question, could be a verbal answer. That student's work can be used to monitor what the student's understanding is, and also is feedback to the student whether they've got it right or not. If a peer says no, that's not right, or if a teacher says it's not right, and the student can change their construct, can change the red bit, can change their version of what you've taught. And the teacher can also see from the students' responses to the learning, their work, their verbal answers and so on, how well they've understood, and as a consequence change the teaching in order to ensure that the student is improving their understanding. So what we need, looking at the top, we need, okay, so so the teacher checks and corrects the students' responses, their work, their verbal answers, and produces this improvement. And this red arrows, you need to go round and round to produce an improvement, a gradual improvement in the student's conception of what you've taught. The first of the lesson is used to devise a ladder of tasks with clear criteria for each topic that you teach. So let's become a bit clearer in a bit. We'll look at that in more details, but we want simple tasks for which just make sure the student understands basics, but we want also more high order tasks to make the students think about what they've been learning. So here's the ladder. We have very simple reproduction tasks where they just reproduce what you've told them. So you tell them what the definition of unemployment is. They repeat it back to you. But they also need simple reasoning tasks. You know, why does this cause unemployment, or whatever it might be? And obviously, understanding the unemployment will help them understand why that thing will cause unemployment. So the lower tasks on the ladder help the student to understand the higher tasks on the ladder. And eventually, we need, when we get towards the end of a topic, we need open, challenging tasks that involve in reasoning. So there are three basic aspects of differentiation. One is to look at the tasks that you set, the ladder of tasks, and that's really, really crucial. You'll never be able to differentiate well. You won't get all of your students learning well unless you do that. The other thing we need to do is to accommodate different preferences and support needs. So somebody who's got a hearing issue, or someone who prefers to have to do their work in a visual way rather than in writing. Those sorts of issues need to be sorted out. And lastly, each student needs their feedback differentiated so that the student gets individual tasks and individual targets. We're really just going to look at the first one here during this talk, the differentiation by task. We'll also look at differentiation by outcome, and also how we can differentiate the time allowed for tasks as well. Now, the most important thing you do is to devise a ladder of tasks, simple to hard, for every topic, and getting the students working on that. That's the most. Okay, so as Julia said, if you can, using the resources that are available to you, can download the PowerPoint presentation. I'm looking at Bloom's Taxonomy, which is probably about the ninth slide, I think, the ninth slide in the pack at the moment. Okay, so the tasks are crucial, we've said. We need a ladder of tasks that start simple and get gradually harder. And ideally, we do that in a way where the lower level tasks assist the student to do the next level task. And then those tasks help the student do the next task as well. So one way of sort of looking at this is to imagine that tasks are of two sorts. One is reproducing tasks, and those are tasks where you tell them stuff and they tell you it back. So, you know, you give them a definition of something and they say the definition of so-and-so is, you know, whatever you've said. So it's just a way of them reproducing stuff. You might show them how to do a sum. They reproduce that way of doing sums. It's a very straightforward, you know, situation where the student is really just reproducing what you've taught them. But then the trouble with that is that it really won't produce real learning. We also, as I'll hope to prove to you in a bit, we need to go to reasoning tasks then. Once we've done some reproducing tasks, tasks that require the student to demonstrate an understanding and develops a deep learning for them. You might see on, I think it's slide 6, which is the Jabberwocky problem. And this is just a way of showing what this important idea that we need this mix of tasks, of reproduction tasks and reasoning tasks. So if I give you a poem like that one, "'Twas brillig and the slithy tobes did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves and the mome raths outgrabe," which is a nonsense poem, of course. It comes from Lewis Carroll. You might think, well, you know, if a teacher says, well, what were the slithy tobes doing in the wabe? You could look at that poem and you could probably answer, because it says, "'Twas brillig and the slithy tobes did gyre and gimble." So you'd say, well, the slithy tobes did gyre and gimble. And I could ask you, what would you describe as the state of the borogoves? And you'll say, well, they're all mimsy. I can tell by the third line. All mimsy were the borogoves. What can you say about the mome raths? The teacher might ask, and the students might say, well, the mome raths outgrabe. So the trouble here, as you can see, is although this is a nonsense poem, the student can answer the questions correctly, and that's really alarming. And to sum up what the Jabberwocky exercise shows, we can say that students need reasoning tasks for deep understanding to make their learning useful. Because if I said, why were the borogoves mimsy? Or what do you think of the mome rath strategy? You wouldn't be able to answer those questions. So this is just a little way of showing, this little game really, to show that if students are just reproducing, you know, what were the slithy tobes doing in the way they were gyring and gimbling, if students are just reproducing, they may not understand. So you've got to go above that. You've got to go to a state where the students are producing a genuine understanding. Okay, I'm going to slide 13 now. Yeah, okay, we're off then. Okay, so we're looking now at slide 13. Okay, slide 13. And this is an example of Jabberwocky learning, or pure surface learning, where students learn something without really understanding it. Research on SATs, you know, those things that school pupils take at the age of 7, 11, 12, whatever, they found that 80% of 12-year-olds with calculators could work out what 225 divided by 15 was. I mean, all they need to do is to type it in, you know, and they can give you the answer. But on the same test, on the same SAT, they also got this question: if a gardener has 225 bulbs to place equally in 15 flower beds, how many would be in each bed? And they couldn't do that. So, you know, there's only 40% could do that. So only half of the students were able to know when to divide, if you like. They weren't able to, most of the students were unable to do this gardener and flower bed problem. And that was almost certainly due, if we look at the next slide, which is slide 14, which, remember, we said that tasks could be reproducing tasks or they could be reasoning tasks. And if you look at slide 15, if you stick to those low order tasks, the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy, if you know about Bloom's taxonomy, then you're going to get this Jabberwocky learning. They'll be able to tell you that the mome raths outgrabe, but they don't know what mome raths are, and they don't know what outgrabing means. So the students can divide on a calculator, but they don't know what they're doing when they're pressing that divide sign. They don't know the meaning of division. In order to get to that meaning, you've got to get students to reason. You've got to get them to think with the information that you've given them. Now, a lot of people say, well, I can't set high order tasks for my level 1 students. Oh, yes, you can. It's just a question, and it's not easy, of devising questions that are appropriate to those particular students, that particular topic. And here's an example. Here are some students who are learning how to make an apple pie the next day. Right, so this is a level 1 craft course, say. Now, the teacher says, when we make our apple pie tomorrow, which of these tools will we need? Now, that's an evaluation question. That's a reasoning question. The students have to think, will I need this knife? Will I need that knife? Which knife should I choose? So it's going to make the students think about the topic that you're teaching. Similarly, question 2 on slide 16. Which of these knives is best for cutting up apples? That one makes the students think like a caterer. Yeah, it's a high order reasoning task. It's an evaluative or a problem solving task. Question 3, how will we make sure we don't cut ourselves? That's clearly a sort of an evaluative question as well. Why must the pastry cover the whole pie? To stop it drying out, or whatever it would be, whatever the right answer might be. So these are why questions. These are reasoning questions, but they're very low level. They're level 1, and you could get lower level reasoning questions too. Unless you set these reasoning questions, students don't get understanding. They just get this Jabberwocky learning, this pure surface learning, where they can just repeat stuff back to you, but they don't really understand it, and they don't know how to make use of it, and they don't know when to use those ideas to solve a problem, and so on. So these high order questions, they generate transferable learning. In other words, if we'd have to do making a beef pie in 2 days' time, they would be able to say, oh, well, we might use this knife, and oh, we'll stop ourselves cutting ourselves by using the knife in this way. And yes, the pastry will have to go over the whole pie, and so on. They are learning general things rather than just about apple pies. So if we go to the next screen, well, actually, let's go to screen 18 now, slide 18, I should say. There's a lovely piece of work done by John Biggs, who's a wonderful educationalist. And he said, if we imagine that there are 2 students in your class, and one is Susan, who's very motivated and concentrates and listens and so on. So you've got Susan in your class. You've also got Robert in your class. Now, Robert is less able, less motivated. And there's a danger if we set a passive low order task, repeat back to me what I've just told you type tasks, fill in the worksheet type tasks. Robert will be acting at the low level, just knowledge, just remembering stuff, writing down the right answer. But Susan will be asking herself questions anyway. Why do we make an apple pie like that? Why do we, why are things like this? When would you use this information? So while you're talking to Susan, she's asking herself high order questions. But Robert isn't. He's just trying to remember, if you're lucky. But if you look at the next slide, slide 19, you'll see that if we set active, high order task, one that asks Roberts and Susan's to answer questions like why, when, how, thinking type questions, then you're forcing Roberts of this world, the low ability students, the less motivated students, you're forcing the Roberts through the cognitive processes which the best students go through for free. They ask themselves these why questions. Roberts need to be asked them because they won't do it for free. So that's another reason why we need to get full learner engagement. We've got to set these reasoning style questions. Slide 20, nice little saying that comes from Dan Willingham, who's written a lovely book called Why Children Hate School, or Why They Don't Like School, something like that. And he says, memory is the residue of thought. He's a cognitive psychologist who summarizes cognitive psychology for teachers. Memory is the residue of thought. What he means is if you have to think about what you've learned, you will better remember it and you'll better be able to understand it. You'll be able to make use of it as well in solving real life problems. So going back to this cycle that we've got in slide 21, you'll see that what we need to do is to set a ladder of tasks that gradually move from reproduction questions that just get the basics up to more simple reasoning tasks, up to more difficult tasks, so that we get all of our students reasoning, even the Roberts of this world, so that they make sense of what they're learning. If I look at slide 22, I'm going to give you a little task here. There'll be a poll on this in a moment, so have a look at what we're asking here is, which of the following methods are best from the point of view of requiring students to create constructs, that's personal meanings in that little red thing in the diagram that I showed you inside the student's head, in terms of requiring students to form constructs and have them corrected, and which of these methods, which I'm about to show you, require the student to reason as well as just to reproduce stuff that you've shown them. So I'm asking you, which of these methods require the student to create constructs and to improve their construct in that cycle which I showed you with the red arrows, and which of these methods require the student to reason rather than simply reproduce. So have a look at slide 23, and I'll leave you a little moment to have a think about this. And groups of the slides on 23 are summarized on slide 24. And the poll is for you to decide whether on slide 24, whether you're going for 1, 2, or 3. 1 is surfing the web and so on. 2 is describing in your own words and so on. And 3 is reading relevant material and so on. So have a look at those methods.
I've just popped that up as well for everybody. You just have to look at my my mug today. We still can't see you, but we can hear you nice and clearly now.
Okay. Is it worth trying to share the screen again or not?
No, don't touch that. You can try and put your camera on again while everyone's answering that poll, but I think we'll leave the slides for today.
Well, I have got my camera on actually, and I can see myself in a little tiny.
You can see yourself. That's right. Can I just reassure everyone that's here? We've got 113. We've done lots of these webinars now, haven't we, Jeff? And I would say 99% of the time it's been absolutely fine. So please don't let this put you off coming back again.
No, this is the only time we've really had problems actually.
Yeah.
What's causing
Sometimes little things happen just before we go live, but generally it's been fine. So please come back. And I'm on hand to send you your CPD certificate on email if you need me to. Any problems with that? Right, I'm going to gather the poll results and stop waffling. Okay, so let me publish the results for everybody. Wow, so 71.4% say describing in your own words, explaining to others, giving advice on a case study, and then followed by 24.5% for reading relevant material, And then the last one at 4.1% is surfing the web.
Yeah. So the trouble with surfing the web is you don't have to necessarily reason. You might just copy and paste it into a handout, or you might just read it. So you're not necessarily doing the reasoning. Describing something in your own words forces you to form an understanding. Explaining it to others, again, forces you to create an understanding. And if you have to give an advice on a case study, you've got to understand the topic really well in order to be able to give that advice. So I'd go for number 2 as being best. Number 3 is pretty good, reading and discussing, as long as you're discussing as well as just reading, because otherwise it's just reproduction, isn't it? The students are just reading and then repeating what you've read. So to summarize, if we go to slide 25, what we're saying is we need ladders of tasks, and this is true for lesson activities. This is true for assignments. This is true for verbal questioning in class. This is true for worksheets. Whatever task you're setting, we need to go from reproduction tasks to simple reasoning tasks to open, challenging reasoning tasks, like working on a case study, for example. You need to make sure that the reproduction tasks will help the student with the simple reasoning tasks, and those simple reasoning tasks are set and devised by you in a way that will help them with the open, challenging reasoning tasks. So you're making them climb this ladder of tasks. And of course, this doesn't always happen. So if you look at slide 26, some rungs on the ladder are missing. So you could have a humanities essay that says, evaluate the importance of unemployment in 21st century Britain, or something like that. And that's a really hard evaluative task. But, the simple reasoning tasks and the reproduction tasks are missing. So the student hasn't been helped by first, asking them, what is unemployment? Why does X cause more unemployment, and so on? That will be a simple reasoning task. If you start off with these lower order tasks, you can get the student to climb up to the higher order ones. Very often a vocational assignment, which I've shown in slide 27, a vocational assignment will have reproduction tasks in it, and then it will suddenly leap to a high order task. The simple reasoning tasks are missing, and so the student will find it very difficult to cope with the challenging task that you've got on a case study at the end of your assignment, because they haven't done simple reasoning tasks to get them to understand the basics, as it were. And a really poor vocational assignment might just have reproduction tasks only, and so you've got a danger of Jabberwocky learning, of pure surface learning. There's nothing wrong with reproduction tasks. There's nothing wrong with surface learning, but you mustn't stay there, because students will, not understand what that stuff until they've been forced to think about it to make sense of it. I'd like to this idea of ladders of tasks is one way of differentiating. There's another way, which is called differentiating by different tasks, and I'd like to look at that with you now. This is on slide 30, and you might have come across this because it's very common, but I don't think it's best practice, and neither does Dylan William, who's a pretty stellar expert on learning. The idea here is that you decide on your lesson plan that everybody in the class should be able to do X. Some will also be able to do Y, and a few might be able to do Z. And that might seem sensible, because you're sort of having different expectations of different students depending on their prior learning, their motivation, their ability, or whatever. But there's a real problem with that approach, and there's another poll on this. The major problem, arguably, let me give you the poll first, and then we'll discuss our answers. Looking at that approach of everyone must, some will, a few might, have a look at the poll, which is on slide 31, and have a look at the four statements which are proposed as main problems for this particular approach, the different tasks approach, the everyone must, some will, a few might approach. Have a look at those four on slide 31. I'll give you a moment to think about them, and then we'll ask you which one do you think is the key difficulty with this approach to differentiation.
While we're doing that, I can see you now, by the way.
Oh, good.
We've had a couple of questions come in. Do you mind if I read one of those out?
Okay.
Daniel's just asking, does he mean to put all these rungs into each lesson or exercise, or in subsequent lessons you should move on from reproduction onto the reasoning and so on? So that's a question.
That's a very good question. I'm thinking of a topic. So you could possibly spend a lot of time on reproduction type tasks on lesson 1, and then lesson 2 you move up to simple reasoning, and then lesson 3 and 4 you do challenging. It's up to you. It might just be that you do an information dump in lesson 1. That's the trouble, where you're giving the students so much information without them having to process it, without them having to think about it, that they may not remember what you said. So it's better to mix in each of your lessons as you can, if you can, and have at least some simple reasoning tasks whilst you're presenting students with information. Why do you think we do it like this? Why do you think this is true? Those sorts of questions, so that the students are processing the stuff you want them to remember to learn. Okay.
Great. I'll publish those results now for everybody.
Oh, you've got some already, have you? Okay.
Okay, so we've got 33.9% for the weak students might limit themselves to the easier tasks, and then 28.6% for students may know you've grouped them, and also for the everyone must tasks might only require, and then the smallest percentage, 8.9%, for you almost have to write 3 lesson plans.
Okay, well, it's a bit of a trick poll, this one. Actually, I think they're all true, I think they're all weaknesses of this differentiating by different tasks. The approach with the ladder that I proposed is the best way. Doesn't have any of these disadvantages, not one. Yeah, because every student is required to do some simple reasoning at least. Yeah, and attempt the more challenging questions. You only have to write 1 lesson plan, 1 worksheet, 1 assignment, whatever. Weak students don't limit themselves to the easier tasks, because when they've finished task 1, you say, well, come on, let's do task 2. I'm expecting everybody to do those. I'm not expecting any student to pull out at a certain point in the lesson. And also, you haven't grouped students, so you've got none of those disadvantages. And that's why differentiation by outcome, as it's called, the ladder approach, is better than differentiating by different tasks approach. Although the differentiation by different tasks is by far the most common approach. So I'm afraid, we all need to do some work on that, I think.
I've got another question from William, which I'd like to put to you. It says that my school's in Kuwait and is completely online currently, and it's difficult to ensure every student's attention and work the room in the same way you could in person. Some students can slip through the gaps as a result, as I can't give every student my undivided attention. Any advice? So we've covered quite a lot of that in past webinars as well, haven't we? But obviously,
yeah, we certainly have. When the COVID virus first hit, I produced a whole series. I think this is the 8th one, the 8th webinar I've done. And the earlier ones were specifically looking at how to teach at a distance with online learning, blended learning, whatever you want to call it. So I would suggest have a look at those, especially the first one, perhaps. But all of those previous 7 webinars are designed to look at strategies that will help those help students to learn whilst they're online, or whilst you're teaching them at a distance. Are there any other questions there, Julia, before we move on?
How would you display the outcomes to the students? That's from Faye.
Well, students can, when they've done these tasks, they can self-assess. They can peer assess if you give them the right answers or work solutions in maths, say. Or you can go around, look over their shoulder and say, yes, well done, and tick, their work. Or you can stop the class and you can say, okay, what have we got for answer as an answer for question 2? Jonathan, tell me your answer. Get the answer, and then you can say to student, this is a method called assertive questioning. Rather than saying, yes, well done, Jonathan, that's right, or no, Jonathan, that's wrong, you say, once you've got an answer from Jonathan, you say to the class, oh, anybody agree with that answer? And if everybody agrees and it's the right answer, you can say, great, and move on. If half the class say they agree and half the class disagree, you can ask the students who disagree, well, why do you disagree with Jonathan? And find out, why, what sort of constructs they've got, how they've formed an understanding, and put those right. There's all manner of ways in which you can show whether the students have, have done it right, as it were. Okay, well, let's move on and have a look at another approach which helps this differentiation, dealing with differences. One of the major differences, and I'm looking now at slide 34, one of the major differences, and I have mentioned this before, because as I've said, differentiation is about high quality teaching to make sure that everybody learns. So this methodology has I've explained briefly before in earlier webinars. One of the problems in differentiating is that some students finish very quickly, and other students are still struggling with, the first of 4 questions. But that doesn't mean they can't all get there. If you think of the driving test as a model, what happens there is you just keep taking the test until eventually you pass it. And almost everybody does. It's hardly anybody, who keeps taking the driving test and doesn't pass. And you can do the same with reproduction and simple reasoning tasks, not the high order stuff. It's a challenging method to use, and I'd suggest you read up a bit about it in one of my books or in somebody else's, to be sure that you're using it properly, because it needs very, very, very simple questions. And the idea here is, for a given topic, you ask the students 4 or 5 questions, and if they get them right, and it's just a little 5-minute test, they mark it themselves. If they've got the questions right, then that's fine. You count them as a pass, and it's not, you don't give them a mark out of 10. You just say passed. Yeah, like the driving test. But if a student's only got 2 of the 4 questions right, and it's only got 5 out of 10 or whatever, then you say, well, have a look at the ones you got wrong. Go back and relearn some stuff. Make sure you're clear on it. I'll give you another test, and this test is done outside of class time, and so is the catch-up work that the student does. They might get help from another student, but it's all done outside of class time. They then do retest outside of class time, and they tell you whether they passed it this time. And they tend not to cheat, actually. The questions are really, really simple and basic and important, and it's just a 4-minute test, a 5-minute test, yeah? But in that way, the slow learners, the ones that need a bit more time, a bit more practice, a bit more thought, a bit more reading, a bit more correction, they get there too, because eventually everybody passes. And so the weaker student thinks, hey, I can do this. I'm okay at physics, or I'm okay at health and social care, or whatever it is. So this is the model. If you look at page screen 35 or slide 35, it's called Mastery Learning. It was actually devised by a chap called Benjamin Bloom, a very, very famous educationalist, he of Bloom's taxonomy. And the idea is you teach a topic for maybe 4 hours, 8 hours. This is level 3. For, level 1 or something, you might make it 2 hours. It's a judgment thing, as ever. And then you set a little diagnostic test, 5 minutes, I would say, 10 minutes, absolute maximum. Yeah. I would say 5 minutes actually. Eventually all the students pass, because if you look at slide 36, you put this thing where the students go round doing remedial work and retesting, doing remedial work, retesting, remedial work, retesting, until eventually they pass. This is a brilliant way of keeping the weaker learners with you, as it were. And it also actually encourages them. They like it, in my experience, because everybody succeeds in the end. But it only works for reproduction tasks and maybe some simple reasoning tasks. Don't set difficult questions. If when you look at your mastery learning test, you think this is too simple and they're going to laugh, you've probably got it about right. And you'll be amazed at how many students will get ones wrong. Important point about mastery learning, it's a high pass mark. So easy questions, high pass mark. So the idea is it's really essential learning, essential simple stuff that they need in order to understand the topic. So they've got to get 8 out of 10. Yeah. If we look
just quickly, Gary's asked an interesting question about what you do with a fast learner to stop them from getting bored.
Yeah. Well, all of the remedial work and all of the retests are done outside of class contact time. You're not being slowed up in any way. You carry on teaching exactly as before. It doesn't slow you up. You're still, and obviously you don't just set mastery tests and tasks because they're all reproduction, Jabberwocky, surface learning tasks. You also set these challenging tasks at the top of the ladder as well. And so the students will all be, trying their top of the ladder task. And the student who's done badly in a mastery test at the beginning of the lesson will think, oh gosh, I've got to go away and do that this weekend and get myself up to speed and retake a test. So all the fixing is done outside of class contact time, so you're not slowed up in any way. There's a sort of a sort of a variation on this approach called mastery marking, which is on slide 37. And this involves the idea that you expect all your students to do work up to, this again would have to be simple stuff, but everybody has to get, say, 8 out of 10 or 7 out of 10 or whatever. Or you might set minimum target grades. You might say of a student, well, you've got really good GCSEs. I'm expecting you to get merits and distinctions only. If you get a pass, then you'll take it away and fix it. Yeah. Even if the examining board doesn't like that and won't put up with the retake mark, you still get the student to retake the work because you want them to learn it better. It's not, the examining body isn't the only determinant as to what work students should do. So you're getting the students to redo work, which is unsatisfactory. In my experience, when you use mastery approaches, students realize they're going to have to get up to a good standard, and they usually get there. Most of the time they get there straight away because they just think, oh God, if I get this wrong or I do a bad mark, I'm going to have to go and do extra work, so I might as well get it right first time. Okay, we've got about 9 or 10 minutes, so I'm just going to very briefly have a look at some best practice. I'm going to miss out the weaker practice that is on slide 38 and 39 and so on. And I'm going to look at the best practice, which occurs on slide 39. So let's have a look at Tina teaching students how to draw graphs. And this is an example of how to embed formative assessment into a class and make sure that students are correcting their understandings as they go. Do you remember that cycle I showed you at the beginning, the quality learning cycle, where there's a sort of little cycle of red arrows that gradually develop the student's understanding? So Tina says, first of all, how do we draw graphs? So she's going to teach how to draw graphs, but the first thing she does is to ask the students, what do you know already? She wants to know what the students have already got in their construct for drawing, what their prior learning is. She discovers and addresses any weaknesses. For example, she discovers they're not very good, say, at devising the right scale for the graph, and shows them how to fix those issues. And if we go on and have a look at the next slide, slide 40, she asks students for criteria for a good graph. Yeah. And then she set some graphs to draw. So she said, this is how to do them. And here's some criteria I want you to meet. And then she sets them to do some drawing. So I'm on slide 41 now, I think. She helps by self-assessment to diagnose any difficulty that the students got. So rather than looking at a piece of work and saying, hey, Joanna, you've got the axes wrong here. What you should have done is to make that longer, and this is how you do it. That's what most teachers will do. But instead, Tina says, have a look at the criteria for axes. Yeah. How do we devise the axes for graphs? Have another look. And so she's trying to get the students to work out for themselves how to improve their own work rather than just telling them how to do it. She reminds students to self-check against the criteria. So, for example, if the criteria is that the graph should have a label on it with a unit, you know, time in seconds or something, if the student misses that off, she doesn't say, put time in seconds on. She says, have a look at the criteria for axes. How have you done? And so the student is self-assessing and getting used to the criteria, getting used to meeting the criteria without help. They're doing it for themselves, as it were. And if we have a look at the next slide, which is slide 42, she asks the students to peer assess each other's work. So they've made some graphs, they've drawn some graphs, and they mark each other's using the criteria. She circulates to help the marking. Yeah, if there's any questions, has Johnny got this right, sort of thing. And then lastly, the students read comments on their marked work, so they get their own work back marked. They check the marking against the criteria, you know, was my peer being fair, and they improve their work if they need to, or they might even be asked to redo one of the graphs if they got it completely wrong. And then the teacher asks for issues and clarifies. Now, that's good. That's good practice, because if you look at slide 44. First of all, she's asked the students, have marked in red sort of the perhaps the most interesting bits in her approach. She asked the students, first of all, how do we draw graphs, to discover what they know already so that she can build on it and improve any misconceptions, you know, correct any misconceptions. She says what the goals are. The graph should be like this. It should be labeled. There should be a unit. You know, the scales should be correctly set, you know, in a certain way. So there are criteria for a good graph. Yeah, she makes it quite clear what the students are aiming to do. So the goals are clear for the student. She gets the students to self-assess against that criteria so that they're thinking for themselves, have I done this right? Could I do this better? That she gets them to self-check and to peer assess using that criteria, and she checks the marking of the students. So the students are very engaged. They're self-assessing and peer assessing, so that they're beginning to work. They get what John Hattie calls assessment savvy. They get to understand the assessment process. They understand the goals. They understand how to improve. They understand what they've done well. In previous talks and in my books, I've mentioned that the ideal feedback is medal and mission feedback, which is a medal for what the students have done well, and a mission for how to get better. But that doesn't have to come from you. It could come from them self-assessing or them being peer assessed. But in order to do that self-assessment, the students need to know what the goals are. So they need to know the goals in order to give themselves medals and missions, so that they are as far as possible in charge of their own self-improvement. So what we've been looking at today, if we look at the diagram on page 45, we've been looking at differentiation, but only looked at the top box on this diagram. We've been looking at differentiation by outcome, which is the ladder approach. It's called that because every student will have a different outcome. Some will do the last task really well, some not so well, but they're all doing the same task on the ladder. Yeah, all the same. So that's called differentiation by outcome. The other approach, differentiation by task, is where you give different tasks to different students. You sometimes have to do that if you've got, say, level 1, level 2, and level 3 students all in the same class studying English or something. Well, you've got to split the students up. If they're all completely different levels and they're all working towards completely different qualification aims, then you do need to set different tasks for different students. But most teaching, we're working towards the same assessment procedures, the same tests, the same assignments. And what helps there to develop the students' learning is this ladder of tasks. But looking again at slide 45, there are two other aspects of differentiation. We might do those in later webinars if you fancy looking at differentiation in more detail. We've covered the single most important topic, this idea of having ladders of tasks going from reproduction to challenging tasks. But there are other ones, accommodating different preferences, so visual and verbal, for example, although learning styles are not used anymore or shouldn't be. We still need to have a multi-sensory approach. Different support needs. Some of your students may have a hearing problem. Some of your students might have a learning difficulty. You might be dyslexic. How do you provide those different support needs? And lastly, the other aspect, I think, of differentiation would be differentiating feedback and then setting individual tasks and targets. And somewhere in between those two, perhaps also, there's scaffolding or help sheets or other means in which you can help students to carry out tasks satisfactorily. So we've just looked at one aspect of differentiation. We may, in later talks, look at other ones. Are there any other questions, do you think, Julia, that we could answer while we're in the last minute or two?
I have had one from Naya, who says, how could we try and incorporate differentiation, particularly if we're short on time? For example, the amount of content that needs to be taught in a certain time frame or preparing students for exams.
Well, all teachers are short of time, and the best way of using the time is to teach in a high quality way with this ladder of tasks. It's a mistake to think that you've got to say everything that you know about the topic when you teach. There isn't time to do that. You can only tell them the stuff that they can absorb in the time that you've got. So you're going to end up missing out a hell of a lot of stuff because you know too much. So you can only ride a horse as fast as it can run. You can only teach a student as fast as they can learn. And you telling them more stuff doesn't help. What you've got to do is to make sure there's a balance between presenting information to them and them thinking with that information, because until they've thought about the information you've given them, they're not going to learn it, not going to remember it, not going to be able to use it in a productive way.
I've just got Daniel just wanted some clarification on something you said. Did you say one should not use learning styles, but rather treat everyone as having a mix of ways?
Yes, the research on learning styles, I wrote a book, Evidence-Based Teaching, and I looked very carefully at the research on learning styles. And the research shows that people don't really have a preference that's important to meet. In putting it very simply, everybody can learn verbally, everybody can learn visually, everybody can learn left brain, everybody can learn right brain, everybody can learn from an activity, everybody can learn by reflecting. What we need is a mix so that the lesson is more productive and there's more variety and more interest, and also so that every student's personal preference is met at some point. But even if you just teach students in their preferred way, they don't learn as well, interestingly, as if you teach them in their preferred way and their non-preferred ways. It's as though the brain is quite complicated in the way it learns. It sort of learns by representing information in multiple ways. So when a student learns maths, for example, they they learn it in a verbal way, they learn it in a written way, they learn it in a visual way, they learn it with objects. And if you have all of those, they always learn better than if you only have one.
Just because we're just going over the time, but I've had a couple of questions. So I'll just read them out quickly, and then we'll wrap up for today. But just to say that any questions that have come in that haven't been answered, and especially because we were a bit delayed with the issues at the beginning, I am putting together a follow-up article on this. So there'll be lots in there. So sign up to the Set newsletter if you haven't already, and it'll be promoted on social media. Patrick's just asking what do you do if the learner doesn't want to cooperate, if he doesn't want to work outside class time? How do you suggest? I mean, that's a lot of that's to do with motivation, isn't it? And
yeah, we did do a session on motivation. One of the earlier webinars. Have a look at that webinar where we looked at motivation. Motivation is a difficult one though, because there's a number of reasons why a student is demotivated. But there's a whole webinar on that. There's a whole hour on that, without technical glitches as well.
Exactly. And Amy just wants to know, and again, if you can't answer this now, I'm going to put all of this, I'm going to make extra effort with this follow-up article, so it's got everything in there that you need. Can you guide us to good resources for the other two parts of differentiation, which we haven't covered today?
Yeah, well, I probably would say this, wouldn't I? But if you wanted to look at making sure that all the students get the support needs they need, have a look at either my books on Catch Them Before They Fall, a chapter called Catch Them Before They Fall, which is about, finding out if a student's beginning to fail or beginning to have trouble, and giving them the support they need. There's stuff in my books about that, but there's also actually a webinar on Catch Them Before They Fall. I think it's the last one, actually. I think it's number 7.
Yes.
So that would be helpful. When it comes to individual support needs, because of sensory impairment and things like that, talk to the expert in your school or college or institution. There'll always be somebody there who's got a special responsibility for equal opportunities for learners, special needs or whatever, different terminologies in different institutions. And say, I've got a student who's got hearing impairment, what should I do? And talk to the student, you've got hearing impairment, how can I help? They're probably the best guide in many ways. Differentiating feedback, there's, again, my books cover that if you look at formative assessment, or if you look at assessment for learning, all of those topics, there's some wonderful books by Dylan William on that. Embedded Formative Assessment, for example, by Dylan William, Embedded Formative Assessment. And my own books deal in a very similar way. It's very similar approaches. I've got a new one out, which is on slide 48, How to Teach Even Better, an evidence-based approach. And that's got a lot of methods in. So does evidence-based teaching. So does Teaching Today. So feedback, individual tasks and targets. There's a thing called learning loops, which is worth looking at in my books. So have a look at that, as that's a great method of differentiating feedback.
So just to answer a few of you who've asked about accessing previous webinars, if you go onto the SET website and just put /webinars, the landing page for all of the webinars that we have done over the past couple of years is there. Just scroll through, or you can just search Jeff Petty webinars, and they're all in there from the date. Maybe what might be useful, actually, I'm just thinking, in the next article I do, I might actually list all of them so they're easier to access in one group. So
that'd be useful with the links.
With the links, make it a bit easier for everyone to find them rather than scrolling through. Okay, so I will sort that out for everybody, but we're going to have to end the webinar now. Thank you so much, Jeff. I've learned so much. I mean, I'm an editor, I'm not a teacher, but I'm just coming to all of your webinars, just learning so much, and I know it's really useful for everyone. And I've had someone say that it's been really good for her qualification that she's doing at the moment for digital skills. She's got loads of ideas, and she said to thank you. So thank you very much again for a fantastic session.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
The next
Sorry about
the
technical problems. We'll make sure that doesn't happen again.
Exactly. And we'll see you in January, I think.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I'll let you all know when the on-demand version is available, so keep an eye out on your emails.
Okay.
See you very soon.